Welcome, I'm your host, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey. Today we are talking about the poisoned orchid affair, but before we start, let me know where you are watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about. Chapter 1, The Orchid on the Dead Man's Desk. It was on a grey morning in late October of the year 1895 that the singular affair of the Ashworth poisoning first intruded upon our lives. I recall the date with precision, for I had spent the better part of that week enduring one of Holmes's more punishing stretches of chemical experimentation, a series of volatile distillations involving coal tar derivatives that had driven Mrs. Hudson to throw open every window on the first floor, despite a bitter wind off the Thames. I sat huddled by the fire with my newspaper, while Holmes, in his stained dressing gown, hunched over his workbench like some gaunt alchemist, muttering to himself and producing, at irregular intervals, small detonations of coloured smoke that left an acrid sweetness hanging in the air. He had been between cases for a fortnight, and I knew the signs well enough. The experiments were not scientific inquiry so much as the restless machinations of a mind that could not bear to sit idle. Twice that week he had sent telegrams to Lestrade inquiring whether Scotland Yard had anything worth his attention, and twice he had received polite refusals. "The criminal classes have grown dull, Watson," he announced that morning, holding a test tube of amber liquid up to the grey light from the window. "The autumn seems to have sapped their ambition along with the leaves." I was spared the obligation of a reply by a sharp knock at the door, followed by the heavy, familiar tread of Inspector Lestrade upon the stair. He entered in his customary fashion, hat in hand, expression hovering between deference and professional pride, and stood dripping on our carpet, for the morning had turned to rain. "You'll forgive the intrusion, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade began, settling himself into the basket chair without waiting to be asked. "I've a matter that is, strictly speaking, already settled. Death by heart failure, Sir Edmund Ashworth, the baronet. His own physician signed the certificate last night, but the solicitor handling the estate has raised a fuss with the insurance company, and they've asked us to take a second look before they pay out. Ordinarily I wouldn't trouble you with it, but there's a detail that's got under my skin." Holmes had not turned from his workbench. "Heart failure is the refuge of the unimaginative coroner, Lestrade, but it is also, on occasion, the truth." "What detail?" "An orchid," said Lestrade, "a single flower, freshly cut, laid on the dead man's desk beside his hand. No vase, no water, just the bloom on the blotter, and nobody in the house will own to placing it there." Holmes set down the test tube. He turned slowly, and I saw that particular sharpening of his features that I had come to recognise as the first stirring of genuine interest, the hawk-sighting movement in the bracken below. "A flower that no one brought and no one claims," he said quietly. "That, Lestrade, is worth my afternoon." The Ashworth estate lay in the better part of Hampstead, behind a high wall of London brick and a row of elms whose last brown leaves rattled in the October wind like the pages of old letters. We arrived by cab shortly after noon, Lestrade having gone ahead to arrange our admittance. The house was handsome and substantial, the sort of residence that speaks of old money carefully tended, though I noticed as we approached that the garden beds had gone somewhat to seed, and a section of guttering along the east wing hung loose against the stone. The study where Sir Edmund had met his end was a large, oak-panelled room on the ground floor, its windows giving onto a walled garden, and beyond it the long glass roof of what I took to be a substantial greenhouse. Holmes paused in the doorway, surveying the room in that peculiar way of his, not examining any single object, but absorbing the totality of the scene as a conductor might listen to an orchestra tuning before a performance. The body had been removed, but little else had been disturbed. A heavy leather armchair stood angled toward the fireplace, its cushion still bearing the impression of a large man's frame. On the desk beside it lay the dead man's personal effects, a half-finished glass of whisky, a folded copy of the evening paper, a tortoise-shell spectacle case, and, precisely centred on the green leather blotter, a single white orchid. Holmes crossed to the desk and bent over the flower without touching it. It was a striking thing, even to my untrained eye. 5 pale petals arranged around a throat of faint lavender. The stem cut cleanly at an angle that suggested a practised hand. Dendrobium, Holmes murmured. Tropical genus. Not easily grown in this climate without considerable expertise and a dedicated hothouse. He straightened. Who found the body? The secretary, Lestrade said, consulting his notebook. James Farrow came in at 11:15 to deliver the evening post and found Sir Edmund slumped in the chair, pipe beside him, stone dead. Holmes moved to the pipe, a handsome meerschaum with a carved bowl resting on a small brass stand at the desk's edge. He lifted it to his nose, inhaled, paused, and inhaled again. A curious expression crossed his face. Not alarm, precisely, but the focused attention of a man who has encountered something unexpected. Without a word, he drew a clean handkerchief from his breast pocket and wrapped the pipe carefully, slipping it into his coat. "I shall need to examine this at Baker Street," he said, offering no further explanation. Lestrade opened his mouth to protest, thought better of it, and made a note. Holmes spent the next quarter of an hour moving through the room with his lens. He examined the position of the armchair, the angle of the reading lamp, the locks on the windows and the door. He paid particular attention to a second entrance I had not initially noticed, a narrow door set into the panelling of the far wall, which opened onto a corridor leading, as Lestrade explained, toward the private family wing. "Unlocked?" Holmes asked. "Always is, according to the servants," said Lestrade. "It's how the family comes and goes without using the main hall." Holmes said nothing, but I saw him file the detail away with the faintest inclination of his head. We were introduced to Lady Constance Ashworth in the morning room. She rose as we entered, a tall, slender woman of perhaps 45, dressed in plain black, her dark hair drawn back from a face that was striking rather than beautiful. Her complexion was pale, her eyes a cool, watchful grey, and her bearing possessed that quality of disciplined composure which one sometimes observes in those who have schooled themselves, through long practice, to reveal nothing they do not choose to reveal. She answered Holmes's questions with precise, measured courtesy. Her husband had dined that evening with his business partner, Mr. Reginald Thorne. She had excused herself early, suffering a headache, and had retired to her rooms at 9 o'clock. She heard nothing unusual. The maid could confirm her retirement. She learned of her husband's death only when Mr. Farrow raised the alarm shortly before midnight. Holmes listened to all of this with an expression of polite attention. Then he asked about the orchid. "I understand you maintain a considerable orchid collection, Lady Ashworth," he said. "The flower on your husband's desk, a dendrobium, if I am not mistaken. Could it have come from your greenhouse?" Something shifted in her expression, a flicker so brief that I might have imagined it, though I am certain Holmes did not. She looked directly at him, and for an instant the composed mask slipped to reveal something harder beneath. "I would know my own blooms, mister. Holmes," she said evenly. "That flower is not from my greenhouse." I noticed, as she spoke, her hands. They rested in her lap with apparent ease, but they were not the hands of an idle gentlewoman. The nails were trimmed short, the fingertips roughened, and there was a faint discoloration along the edges of the right thumb and forefinger that spoke of years of working with soil and stem. They were a gardener's hands, capable, practised, and strong. Holmes thanked her with his customary grace, and we took our leave. In the cab, returning to Baker Street, Holmes sat in silence for some minutes, his chin upon his chest, his long fingers drumming a slow rhythm against his knee. At last he spoke. "The wife is lying about the orchid, Watson." "You cannot know that from a single conversation," I protested, though in truth I had felt the same unease. I can know it from a single instant, he replied. When I named the genus Dendrobium, her pupils dilated. Not with surprise, Watson, but with recognition. She identified the species before I finished the word, and then, in the very next breath, denied it. The question is whether she lies because she is guilty, or because she is afraid. He turned to look out at the grey streets passing beyond the rain-streaked glass. A man found dead in his chair with a warm pipe and a flower no one will claim, he continued, half to himself. A household of secrets, a wife whose hands betray her station, and a locked study with an unlocked door. There is something growing in that house, Watson, something patient and deliberate, and I do not yet know whether we have found a tragedy or a crime. But I mean to find out. It seemed to me, as our cab rattled through the darkening afternoon toward Baker Street, that I had seldom seen Holmes so quickly and so thoroughly engaged by the opening movements of a case. Whatever awaited us in the Ashworth affair, I was already certain of one thing. The orchid on the dead man's desk had not been placed there by accident, and the hand that had cut its stem, I suspected, had known precisely what kind of flower it was leaving behind. Chapter 2. The Tangled Roots. It was Holmes's practice, when a case had taken hold of his imagination, to divide the labour of inquiry between us, sending me to gather the surface impressions of character and reputation, while he pursued those deeper, less visible threads that only his peculiar faculties could detect. So it was that the morning following our visit to Hampstead found me making the rounds of Sir Edmund Ashworth's social circle, while Holmes returned alone to the house under the pretence of a follow-up inspection. I began at the Dorian Club in St. James's, where Sir Edmund had been a member for over 20 years. The portrait that emerged from the leather armchairs and cigar smoke of the reading room was consistent and, on its surface, admirable. Sir Edmund was remembered as a charming man, generous with his hospitality, quick with a story from his military days, and a reliable presence at charitable functions. He had served with distinction in Afghanistan, had come home to manage the family investments, and had married well. The consensus among his fellow members was one of comfortable respect. Yet beneath the polish, there were cracks. An elderly stockbroker named Harding, loosened by a second brandy, confided that Sir Edmund's financial affairs had taken a worrying turn in recent years. Speculative ventures, Harding said, with a particular delicacy that men of business employ when they mean gambling. Not the sort of thing one expects from a man of his background. Another member, pressed gently, admitted that Sir Edmund had borrowed money from at least 2 fellow members, and had not repaid either debt. And when I mentioned the name Helena Graves, casually, as though I had encountered it in passing, there was a silence that told me everything the words that followed did not. A family friend, one man said, studying his glass. Edmund was generous with his friendships. The emphasis on the word was unmistakable. I returned to Baker Street in the early afternoon to find Holmes already installed by the fire, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression that of a man sorting through a complex hand of cards. "You have been busy," I observed, noting the fresh mud on his boots and a faint trace of perfume on his coat sleeve that was certainly not Mrs. Hudson's. "As have you, I expect. Tell me about the club." I relayed my findings, the whispers of financial ruin, the delicate allusions to Helena Graves, and Holmes nodded as though I were confirming what he already knew. The household told me rather more, he said. I interviewed the secretary, the son, and had the unexpected pleasure of meeting the mistress herself. He recounted each in turn. James Farrow, the secretary, had been excessively cooperative, too much so, in Holmes's estimation. His account of discovering the body was detailed to the point of rehearsal, and his hands had trembled throughout. More telling, Farrow had volunteered, without being asked, that young Victor Ashworth had quarrelled violently with his father 2 days before the death. "A man who steers suspicion toward another," Holmes observed, is either genuinely helpful or anxious to direct attention away from himself. Victor Ashworth had been another matter entirely. The young man had received Holmes in the upstairs parlour with an air of sullen defiance, making no effort to disguise his feelings toward his dead father. He was a tyrant and a fraud, Victor had said flatly. I won't pretend to mourn him, Mr. Holmes. If that makes me a suspect, so be it. When pressed about his movements on the evening of the death, Victor claimed he had been at his club the entire night. Holmes detected the lie at once, a slight shift in posture, an involuntary glance toward the window, but chose not to press the point. His anger is real, Holmes told me, but it is the anger of a young man who despised his father and is horrified to find that he does, after all, grieve. Whether it is also the anger of a killer remains to be seen. The most illuminating encounter, however, had been the unscheduled arrival of Helena Graves. She had appeared at the Ashworth house during Holmes's visit, ostensibly to pay her respects as a friend of the family. Holmes described her as a woman of considerable beauty and sharp intelligence, perhaps 30, dressed well but not extravagantly, her composure fractured by genuine distress. Lady Constance had received her in the drawing-room with a civility so precise and so cold that Holmes said it reminded him of a surgical instrument, designed to cut without appearing to move. The two women sat across from one another, Holmes recounted, and conducted a conversation of such exquisite, frozen politeness that every word carried the weight of what was not being said. Lady Constance offered tea. Miss Graves declined. Lady Constance expressed gratitude for the visit. Miss Graves expressed sorrow for the loss. Neither woman looked away from the other for a single instant. It was, Watson, one of the most remarkable performances of mutual hatred I have ever witnessed, and I have witnessed a great many. Holmes had observed one further detail. Helena Graves carried a letter in her handbag, not concealed, but clutched with a reflexive tightness that suggested she had brought it for a purpose, and then, finding Holmes present, thought better of producing it. He could not determine the letter's contents, but its existence interested him considerably. I asked about Reginald Thorne, the business partner. Holmes had not yet spoken with him directly, but I was able to supply what I had gathered at the club. Thorne was known as a bluff, practical man of business who had partnered with Sir Edmund in several investment ventures. I had encountered him briefly in the club's dining room, where he expressed shock at Edmund's death with what seemed genuine feeling, though his first substantive remark concerned the financial implications for their shared holdings. Seemed perfectly well when I left him that night, Thorne had told me. A bit tired. Perhaps. We'd had a long discussion about business matters. He said these last words with a careful neutrality that suggested the discussion had been anything but routine. That evening, as the fog pressed against our windows and the fire burned low, Holmes sat in silence for a long while. I'd learned over the years to recognize the different qualities of his silences, the restless quiet of boredom, the coiled stillness of concentration, and this, the rarest variety, the contemplative silence of a man surveying a landscape of human frailty and calculating where the ground was firmest. At last, he reached for his pipe and spoke. 6 people with reason to want Sir Edmund Ashworth dead, Watson, and each of them is lying about something. The wife lies about the orchid. The son lies about his whereabouts. The mistress conceals a letter she lacks the courage to deliver. The secretary steers suspicion with the practised hand of a man accustomed to misdirection. The doctor, whom we have not yet examined, but whose generous prescriptions I mean to scrutinize, lies, I suspect, about the depth of his professional concern. And the business partner lies about the nature of his final dinner with the deceased. He struck a match and held it to the bowl. The challenge before us is not to find guilt. It is everywhere. The challenge is to sort the guilty from the merely ashamed. Chapter 3. The Sweetness in the Ash, I have remarked elsewhere that Holmes, when seized by the full intensity of a chemical investigation, became something other than the man I knew in the ordinary hours of our companionship. The wit vanished, of the languor evaporated, and what remained was a creature of pure, ferocious concentration, a mind stripped of every social grace and directed with almost frightening precision toward a single point of inquiry. So it was on the morning following our interviews at the Ashworth house, when I descended to our sitting room to find him already installed at his workbench, surrounded by an arsenal of glass vessels, copper burners, and reagent bottles, the meerschaum pipe of the late Sir Edmund Ashworth mounted in a small laboratory clamp before him, like a patient upon an operating table. He had not slept. The ashtray beside him held the remains of 3 cigarettes, and a cup of coffee sat untouched and cold at his elbow. He did not look up when I entered. "Breakfast?" I ventured. "Irrelevant," he said, without turning. I poured myself tea and settled into my chair to observe. I had learned that there was no profit in attempting to engage Holmes during these periods, and some genuine risk of provoking a response that would sour the remainder of the day. Instead, I watched, and I confess that even after years of proximity to his methods, the precision of his laboratory technique retained the power to fascinate. He had scraped the interior of the pipe's bowl with a fine steel instrument, collecting the residue onto a glass slide. This he subjected to a sequence of tests whose purposes I could only partially follow, dissolving portions of the sample in various solutions, heating them over the burner, observing the colour changes and precipitates with his magnifying lens. He made notes in his rapid, angular hand, muttering occasionally in a language that seemed to hover between English and Latin. At one point he held a test tube up to the window and studied the pale amber liquid within it for nearly a full minute, turning it slowly in the grey morning light. "There," he said at last, the first word he had spoken in over an hour. "Do you see it, Watson?" I rose and crossed to the bench. The liquid in the tube was faintly clouded, with a sediment settling to the bottom that caught the light, with a dull, organic shimmer, quite unlike any mineral precipitate I had encountered in my medical training. What am I looking at? Something that should not be there. He set the tube in a rack and turned to face me, his grey eyes alight with that cold fire I knew so well. The residue in Sir Edmund's pipe contains organic compounds that are not present in any tobacco blend commercially available in England, nor, I suspect, anywhere else. The alkaloid signature is plant-derived, complex, and entirely inconsistent with what a man should be inhaling when he smokes his evening pipe. A poison? An alkaloid, certainly. Whether it constitutes a poison in the legal sense depends upon the dose, the method of delivery, and the intent behind its introduction, all of which remain to be established. But I can tell you this much. Someone has been putting something into that pipe that was never meant to be smoked. Something that, when heated, would volatilize and be drawn directly into the lungs with each inhalation. And the chemical structure, he tapped his notebook, shares certain characteristics with alkaloids found in tropical plant species, specifically, Watson, in orchids. The word hung in the air between us. I thought of the white bloom on the dead man's desk, the greenhouse visible through the study windows, and Lady Constance Ashworth's cool grey eyes as she denied all knowledge of it. "Good God," I said, "theology will not help us. Chemistry might. I need to consult someone whose knowledge of tropical botany exceeds my own, which is, I freely admit, a field where my expertise has limits. Get your coat, Watson. We are going to Kew." The Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew, even in late October, retained a grandeur that no amount of autumn decay could diminish. The great glass houses rose against the overcast sky like cathedrals dedicated to some older, greener faith, and the air within them, warm, dense, impossibly fragrant after the chill of the grounds, struck the senses with an almost physical force as we passed through the doors. Holmes had sent a telegram ahead, and we were met by Professor Julian Ainsworth, the garden's senior specialist in tropical orchidaceae, a lean, weathered man of 60 with the distracted manner of a scholar and the calloused hands of someone who spent more time with soil than with books. He received us in a cluttered office adjoining the tropical house, its walls lined with botanical illustrations and specimen jars, and listened with sharpening interest as Holmes described the chemical signature he had isolated from the pipe residue. "You are certain of the alkaloid structure?" Ainsworth asked, adjusting his spectacles. "As certain as my reagents permit. I should welcome your independent confirmation." Holmes produced his notes and the sealed test tube. Ainsworth examined both with the unhurried thoroughness of a man for whom precision was not a professional obligation, but a personal religion. He held the tube to the light, unstopped it, inhaled cautiously, and frowned. "The signature is consistent with certain dendrobium species," he said slowly. "There are alkaloids present in several members of the genus, dendrobine being the most well documented, that produce cardiovascular effects when concentrated and administered in sufficient quantity. But, Mr. Holmes, no naturally occurring dendrobium produces a toxin of this potency. The concentration you have described would require deliberate cultivation, selective hybridization over many generations to amplify the alkaloid content far beyond what nature provides." "How many generations?" "At minimum, 3 to 4 successive crossings with careful selection at each stage. You would need to begin with a species already high in alkaloid content, Dendrobium nobile perhaps, or one of the Southeast Asian variants, and breed systematically for toxicity. It would take a patient gardener, Mr. Holmes, a very patient gardener indeed, and no less than a year, even under ideal conditions." Holmes leaned forward. "And the symptoms? If such a concentrated alkaloid were inhaled through pipe smoke, a small quantity at first, increasing over weeks?" Ainsworth considered this. "The early symptoms would be subtle: fatigue, for dizziness, a sense of the heart labouring. As the cumulative dose increased, you would see more pronounced cardiac irregularity, arrhythmia, shortness of breath, possibly visual disturbances. The mechanism would be similar to digitalis toxicity, disrupting the electrical conduction of the heart. In fact," he paused, a new thought striking him, "in a patient already being treated with digitalis preparations, the combined effect would be extraordinarily difficult to distinguish from the medication's own side effects. A physician monitoring such a patient would see exactly what he expected to see. He would increase the digitalis dose to manage the worsening symptoms, never suspecting that the symptoms themselves had an entirely separate origin." "The perfect camouflage," Holmes said quietly. "Precisely. And the beauty of the delivery method, if one may use such a word for something so monstrous, is that the heat of combustion would destroy the greater part of the evidence with each use. Whatever residue survived in the pipe would be minimal and would require sophisticated analysis to detect. Any competent physician examining the body would find a heart that had simply stopped, and a medical history that explained why." There was a silence in the little office. Through the glass partition, I could see the tropical orchids in their heated house, hundreds of them hanging in their mossy cradles, their strange and beautiful faces turned toward the artificial light. It seemed to me that there was something obscene in the thought that such delicate things could be made instruments of death. "Professor," Holmes said, "I must ask you to treat everything we have discussed as confidential." "Naturally. And I must ask one further question. In your knowledge of the botanical community in London, the serious amateurs, the hybridizers, the collectors, how many individuals would possess both the expertise and the facilities to undertake such a project?" Ainsworth removed his spectacles and polished them thoughtfully. "Expertise in dendrobium hybridization at this level? perhaps a dozen in all of England. The facilities, a dedicated tropical house with precise climate control, perhaps half that number. But Mr. Holmes, the combination of expertise, facilities, and the specific knowledge of alkaloid concentration required to breed for toxicity rather than beauty. He replaced his spectacles and looked at Holmes steadily. I should be surprised if the number exceeded 2 or 3. We spoke little on the return journey to Baker Street. Holmes sat with his chin upon his breast, his fingers drumming their slow, restless pattern against his knee, his eyes fixed on some interior landscape that I could not see. It was only as our cab turned into the familiar stretch of Baker Street that he broke the silence. "This is not a crime of passion or opportunity, Watson. This is a crime of gardening. 14 months of patient, deliberate cultivation, the careful nurturing of a living weapon, season by season, crossing by crossing, until it reached the precise concentration required to kill. Consider the mind that conceived it. Consider the discipline required to sustain it. Consider the depth of feeling, whether hatred or desperation or something altogether more complex, that could drive an intelligent person to invest more than a year of their life in the creation of an instrument of murder so elegant that it destroys itself in the act of killing." He fell silent again as we mounted the stairs to our rooms. At the door, he paused and turned to me. "We are not looking for an opportunist, Watson. We are not looking for someone who seized a moment of rage or a convenient bottle of arsenic. We are looking for someone who decided, more than a year ago, that another human being must die, and then set about the task with the patience and precision of a scientist conducting an experiment. That is a very particular kind of killer. And the circle of persons who possess both the botanical knowledge and the emotional motive for such an undertaking is, I suspect, vanishingly small. I thought of Lady Constance Ashworth, her gardener's hands, her cool composure, her private greenhouse with its locked doors and tropical warmth. I thought of the orchid on the dead man's desk and her denial, delivered with such steady conviction that I had almost believed it. "Holmes," I said carefully, "you cannot mean—" "I mean nothing yet, Watson. I observe, I analyze, and I refrain from conclusions until the evidence compels them. But I will tell you this." He pushed open the door and stood silhouetted against the lamplight within. "The killer we seek is someone who understands orchids not merely as objects of beauty, but as living systems to be manipulated. Someone with access to a private hothouse, someone whose patience is measured not in days but in seasons, and someone whose grievance against Sir Edmund Ashworth was deep enough and old enough to sustain that patience through 14 months of silent, methodical preparation." He stepped inside and reached for his chemical apparatus. "Tomorrow, Watson, we examine the dead man's private papers. Tonight, I have a toxin to identify." Chapter 4. Letters and Lies. The private papers of a dead man are, in my experience, among the most melancholy objects one encounters in the course of a criminal investigation. They are the residue of a life stripped of its public performance. The unpaid bills, the indiscreet letters, the half-finished correspondence that reveals with pitiless clarity the distance between the man the world believed it knew and the man who actually existed. Sir Edmund Ashworth's papers were no exception. Indeed, they constituted a more damning portrait of their author than any prosecution could have assembled, and Holmes and I spent the better part of a grey November morning sorting through them in the dead man's study, while James Farrow hovered at the periphery like a nervous bird, offering assistance that neither of us required. Lestrade had arranged the warrant with his customary efficiency, and Holmes had insisted that Farrow remain present during the search. Not, as I initially supposed, because he valued the secretary's cooperation, but because he wished to observe which documents produced a reaction in the man and which did not. It was a technique I had seen Holmes employ before, the suspect as unwitting interpreter of his own secrets. The financial records came first, and they told a story of ruin so complete that even Holmes, who was not easily moved by matters of commerce, paused in his examination to shake his head. Sir Edmund had, over the course of 3 years, systematically destroyed a fortune that had taken his family 4 generations to accumulate. The gambling debts were staggering, not the genteel losses of a man who wagered too freely at his club, but the catastrophic hemorrhage of a compulsive speculator who had moved from horses to commodities to foreign markets with escalating recklessness. Promissory notes, margin calls, letters from creditors ranging in tone from polite concern to barely concealed threat, the archive of a financial collapse conducted in secret while the household continued to operate on the assumption of wealth. The estate is worthless, Holmes said flatly, setting aside a ledger. Worse than worthless, it is encumbered with debts that exceed its total assets by a factor of 3. The life insurance policy is the only object of value remaining in Sir Edmund Ashworth's name. Farrow, standing by the window, had gone very pale. I noticed that his eyes moved repeatedly to a particular drawer of the desk, the lower left, with an involuntary anxiety that suggested he knew what it contained and dreaded its discovery. Holmes, who missed nothing, opened that drawer last. Inside, beneath a false bottom whose construction was obvious to Holmes's practised fingers, lay a bundle of letters tied with a green ribbon. They were written in a feminine hand, graceful, educated, but with an undertone of increasing desperation that made itself felt even before one attended to the words. They were the letters of Helena Graves. I will not reproduce their contents in detail, for they were private communications of an intimate nature, and whatever Miss Graves's failings, she did not write them with the expectation that they would be read by strangers. It is sufficient to say that they documented, with painful clarity, a relationship that had begun nearly a decade earlier in passion and mutual delight, had produced a child, a daughter now 7 years old, and had deteriorated over the final year into a bitter negotiation between a woman who had been promised everything and a man who could no longer deliver anything. The later letters were especially revealing. Helena had written, some 4 months before Sir Edmund's death, a passage that Holmes read aloud in a quiet, neutral voice. "You promised me a life, Edmund. Not visits, not envelopes of money slipped under my door like payment for services rendered, but a life. Your daughter asks for you. I have run out of lies to tell her." And then, more recently, a letter dated just 6 weeks before the death. Its tone entirely changed. Cold, businesslike, stripped of sentiment. "You say you can no longer afford to maintain us. Very well. But you will understand that I must now consider my own position, and that of our child. Without reference to your promises." Holmes set the letters aside and reached deeper into the concealed compartment. There, folded and unfinished, was a document of an entirely different character, a draft letter in Sir Edmund's own hand, addressed to Helena Graves, never sent. It read in part, "I know what you have done. The letter your conscience compelled you to write to my wife. Do not insult me by denying it, for I intercepted your earlier correspondence with that Camden postmark, and I have read what you told her. You have wounded the one person who still believed in the fiction of our family. I will never forgive you for that, though I doubt you acted from conscience. More likely from spite, having found that your expectations of me will not be met." Holmes read this twice, then laid it flat upon the desk and regarded it in silence. "There it is, Watson," he said at last, "the fuse that lit the powder. Helena Graves wrote anonymously to Lady Constance revealing the affair and the child. Sir Edmund discovered this, or deduced it, and never sent his reply. But the damage was done. Lady Constance knew." "And the anonymous letter itself?" I asked. "Where is it?" "Not here. which means Lady Constance has it, or destroyed it. In either case, the implications are the same. She has known about her husband's infidelity, his secret child, and the diversion of household funds to support his mistress, for at least as long as that letter has been in existence. He glanced at his notes. Helena's earlier correspondence suggests the anonymous letter was sent approximately 18 months before the death. I mark that date, Watson. It is, I suspect, the true beginning of this affair. I marked it, and felt a cold precision in the coincidence. 18 months. Professor Ainsworth had estimated that the cultivation of the toxic orchid hybrid would require no less than a year. If Lady Constance had received the anonymous letter 18 months before her husband's death, and had begun her botanical work shortly thereafter, the timeline aligned with a terrible exactness. That afternoon, Holmes and I called upon Helena Graves at her lodgings in Camden, a modest but respectable house on a quiet street, its front steps swept clean and its curtains drawn against the autumn chill. She received us in a small sitting room that bore the marks of careful economy. Good furniture, but worn. Fresh flowers, but cheap ones. A child's drawing pinned to the mantelpiece with obvious pride. She was, as Holmes had described, a woman of striking appearance. Dark-haired, fine-featured, with large brown eyes that held an intelligence and a wariness in equal measure. She had been weeping before our arrival. That much was evident from the redness about her eyes and the handkerchief clutched in her lap. But she composed herself with a visible effort, and met Holmes's gaze directly. "I know why you are here, Mr. Holmes," she said, "and I know what you have found among Edmund's papers. I will not insult you with the pretence of being merely a family friend." "I appreciate your candour, Miss Graves." "It is not candour. It is exhaustion. I've been maintaining fictions for nearly 10 years, and I find that I no longer have the strength for it." She told her story with a directness that I found unexpectedly affecting. She had met Sir Edmund at a gallery exhibition when she was 21, a woman of modest background, clever and ambitious, dazzled by a charming man who seemed to offer the world. The affair had begun within weeks. The child had arrived 2 years later. Edmund had installed Helena in the Camden lodgings, provided a monthly allowance, and promised, always promised, that he would leave his wife, that they would marry, that their daughter would bear his name. "And you believed him?" Holmes asked, without judgment. "I believed him because I needed to, Mr. Holmes. When a woman has built her entire life upon a single man's word, she does not examine that word too closely. And by the time I understood that his promises were worthless, my daughter was 5 years old, and I had no profession, no savings, and no reputation that would survive the truth." Holmes asked about the anonymous letter. Helena's composure faltered for the first time. "Yes," she said quietly. "I wrote it. 6 months before he died. I was angry. He had just told me he could no longer afford to support us, that his investments had failed, that there was no money. And yet I knew he still maintained the house in Hampstead, still paid for his club, still bought orchids for that greenhouse as though nothing had changed. Everything was to be sacrificed except the appearance of his respectable life." She paused. "I wanted Lady Constance to know. I told myself it was justice. Perhaps it was only cruelty. I've had a great deal of time to consider the distinction, and I confess I still cannot locate it." And her response? "There was none. I wrote anonymously. I had not the courage to sign my name. I heard nothing. I assumed the letter had been ignored or destroyed." Holmes then raised the matter of the insurance policy, the smaller policy held under a shell company name, listing Helena as beneficiary. Her reaction was immediate and, to my eye, entirely genuine. Shock, confusion, and then a dawning horror as she understood the implication. "I knew nothing of its value," she said. "Edmund arranged it. He said it was a business formality, something to do with his company accounts. I signed papers. I did not read them carefully. You must believe me, Mr. Holmes. "I did not know." Holmes studied her for a long moment, yet whatever he saw in her face appeared to satisfy him, for he inclined his head slightly and moved on. He asked about her movements on the night of the death. She had been at home, she said. Her landlady, Mrs. Phelps, could confirm it. She had not left the house. "Mrs. Phelps retires early, I understand," Holmes said. "She does, and she's hard of hearing. I know what that means for my alibi, Mr. Holmes. I can only tell you the truth and hope it is sufficient." We took our leave shortly after. On the pavement outside, Holmes stood for a moment in the fading afternoon light, watching a sparrow pick at crumbs between the cobblestones. "Her grief is real, Watson," he said. "She loved him, or believed she did, which amounts to the same thing when measured against the capacity for murder. Her anger is directed inward as much as at the dead man. I do not think she killed Sir Edmund Ashworth. But the insurance policy was Edmund's arrangement, not hers. A man protecting his mistress and child through the only mechanism available to him. A shell company and an insurance clause. It is suspicious in appearance and perfectly innocent in origin. Miss Graves is guilty of many things: poor judgment, misplaced trust, an act of anonymous cruelty that may have set darker events in motion. But she is not, I think, a poisoner." He turned up his collar against the evening chill. "We now have two women with reason to hate Sir Edmund Ashworth, Watson. One who was betrayed and one who was discarded. The anonymous letter connects them, a thread of shared suffering that neither woman fully understands. Helena struck the match, and the question is what Lady Constance built with the fire." Chapter 5. The Greenhouse. There are occasions in the course of an investigation when Holmes's methods require not the dramatic confrontation or the clever ruse, but something altogether more subtle: the patient cultivation of a suspect's trust through the exercise of genuine interest. I have observed that Holmes, for all his reputation as a cold logician, possesses an authentic curiosity about the workings of the world that extends far beyond the criminal. He can speak with authority on subjects ranging from medieval music to the composition of Cornish clays, and when he encounters a mind of real expertise, he engages with it not as a stratagem, but as a fellow traveller in the country of knowledge. It was this quality that he brought to bear upon Lady Constance Ashworth on the afternoon we visited her greenhouse, and it was this quality that made the visit both the most illuminating and the most unsettling episode of the case thus far. Holmes had arranged the call under the pretext of identifying the orchid found on Sir Edmund's desk. The flower, he explained in a note delivered that morning, remained unaccounted for, and as Lady Constance was the foremost orchid cultivator in the household, her expertise would be invaluable in tracing its origin. It was a transparent fiction. We both knew the orchid had come from her greenhouse, and she knew that we suspected as much. But it served its purpose. She could not refuse without appearing obstructive, and Holmes could not be denied access without arousing the very suspicion she wished to avoid. She met us at the garden door on a cold, bright afternoon, dressed in a plain grey wool dress with a gardening apron tied at her waist, her dark hair pinned loosely beneath a broad-brimmed hat. Without the formal armour of the drawing-room, she appeared younger and less guarded, a woman in her element, surrounded by the things she understood and loved. She led us along a gravel path through the walled garden, past beds of dormant roses and the skeletal frames of summer borders, to the greenhouse that occupied the full length of the estate's southern wall. It was a substantial structure, larger than I had expected, perhaps 60 feet long and 20 wide, constructed of iron and glass in the modern style, with a central aisle flanked by raised beds and hanging baskets. The warmth struck us as we entered, dense and humid after the October chill, carrying with it a fragrance so complex and layered that it seemed less a scent than an atmosphere. Earth and moss and the sweet alien perfume of 100 tropical species blooming in defiance of the English autumn. Lady Constance was transformed. The glacial composure of our first meeting gave way to something warmer, more animated, as she guided us through her collection. She spoke of her orchids with the precision of a scientist and the tenderness of a mother, their temperaments, their requirements, their individual histories. This Cattleya had been acquired from a collector in Sao Paulo and had taken 3 years to acclimatise. That Vanda had been rescued from a failing nursery in Singapore and had rewarded her patients with a bloom of extraordinary beauty the previous spring. She knew each specimen by name, by provenance, by the particular adjustments of temperature and humidity that kept it alive so far from its native soil. Holmes listened with an attention that was, I believe, entirely sincere. He asked questions that revealed a working knowledge of botany I had not suspected, inquiries about pollination techniques, about the chemistry of orchid fragrances, about the challenges of hybridization in a temperate climate. Lady Constance answered with evident pleasure, and I observed between them a quality of intellectual recognition that transcended the circumstances of our visit. They were, for those minutes, simply two clever people discussing a subject that fascinated them both. I found myself momentarily forgetting that one of them might be a murderer, and the other was certainly trying to prove it. It was Holmes who steered the conversation, with imperceptible skill, toward the rear section of the greenhouse. The structure was divided into climate zones, a cooler section near the entrance for temperate species, a warmer middle zone, and at the far end, screened by muslin curtains hung from iron rods, a section of almost suffocating tropical heat where the most delicate and demanding specimens were housed. Holmes parted the curtains with a casual hand and stepped through. I followed, and found myself in a space that felt more like a fragment of the equatorial jungle than a corner of Hampstead. The air thick enough to taste, the light filtered to a green-gold dimness through the overhead glass. Several dendrobium specimens hung in moss-lined baskets from the iron framework, their roots trailing like pale fingers in the humid air. Holmes examined them with apparent admiration. Then his gaze moved to a planting bed along the far wall, a raised wooden frame filled with a dark, rich-growing medium. It was conspicuously empty. The soil had been recently disturbed, the surface raked smooth but bearing the faint impressions of plant stakes that had been removed. Whatever had grown here had been taken out not long ago, and the bed had been cleaned with considerable care. "A casualty?" Holmes asked lightly, gesturing toward the empty bed. Lady Constance had followed us through the curtains. Her expression, which had been open and animated throughout our tour, underwent a subtle change. Not alarm, precisely, but a tightening of attention, as though a door that had been left carelessly ajar had been quietly pulled shut. "A failed experiment," she said evenly. "I was attempting a hybridization that did not take. The specimens declined, and I disposed of them last week. Not every crossing succeeds, Mr. Holmes. One learns to accept the losses." "A pity," Holmes said. "What were you attempting?" "A cross between Dendrobium nobile and a variant I acquired from a collector in Burma. I had hoped to produce a bloom of unusual colour, but the hybrid proved unstable. These things happen." Holmes accepted this with a nod and turned his attention to a workbench set against the glass wall. It was neatly arranged, pruning shears, grafting knives, labels, twine, small glass bottles of what appeared to be fertilizer solutions, and among the implements a stone mortar and pestle of the kind used for grinding botanical preparations. Holmes picked up the mortar, turned it in his hands as though admiring its craftsmanship, and set it down again. I did not see what his fingers did in the instant between lifting and replacing, but I knew Holmes well enough to be certain that a sample of whatever residue the mortar contained was now in his possession. He then asked to see the greenhouse logbook. Lady Constance produced it from a shelf near the entrance, a large, leather-bound volume filled with entries in her precise, slanting hand. Holmes turned the pages with an expression of scholarly interest. pausing occasionally to ask about a particular entry. The log was meticulous. Dates of planting, watering schedules, temperature readings, fertilizer applications, notes on growth and flowering. I watched Holmes's eyes as he scanned the pages, and I saw the moment, imperceptible to anyone who did not know him, when he found what he was looking for. A slight widening of the pupils, a fractional pause in the rhythm of his page-turning, and then he moved on as though nothing had occurred. He closed the book, thanked Lady Constance for her generosity, and complimented the collection with what sounded like genuine warmth. We took our leave through the garden. As we walked toward the gate, I fell into step beside Lady Constance, while Holmes moved ahead, apparently absorbed in examining a late-blooming clematis on the garden wall. She turned to me with an expression I had not seen from her before, not the composed mask of our first interview, nor the animated intelligence of the greenhouse tour, but something softer and more tired. "You are a medical man, Dr. Watson," she said. "Do you find that your profession leaves you with much faith in human nature?" "Some days more than others," I admitted. She smiled, a brief melancholy expression that altered her face entirely. "I envy the variability. I find that mine diminishes rather steadily." She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "My husband was not the man the world believed him to be, Doctor, but I suppose that is true of most of us." I did not know how to reply, and was spared the necessity by Holmes's return. We said our farewells with the usual courtesies, and Lady Constance watched us from the garden door as our cab pulled away, a solitary figure in grey against the dark brick of the house, one hand resting on the doorframe, the other hanging at her side with the stillness of someone who has long since ceased to expect anything from the world beyond the walls of her own making. At Baker Street, Holmes went directly to his workbench. He produced from his pocket a folded paper containing the residue he had obtained from the mortar and pestle, and subjected it to the same battery of tests he had performed on the pipe residue 2 days earlier. I sat by the fire and waited. The analysis took less than an hour. "It matches," he said, setting down his instruments. "The alkaloid signature in the mortar is consistent with the residue in the pipe. She ground the extract in that greenhouse and applied it to the bowl of his pipe, Watson. The evidence is not yet sufficient for a court of law, but it is sufficient for me." He moved to the fireplace and stood gazing into the flames. His expression held none of the satisfaction I might have expected. Instead, there was a heaviness about him, the weariness of a man who has confirmed a suspicion he had hoped might prove unfounded. "She is remarkable, Watson," he said at last. "The logbook contains entries for a specimen designated only by number, Specimen 47. Every other plant in that greenhouse has a proper name. This one is identified only by a numerical code, and the cultivation conditions recorded for it are precisely those required to concentrate alkaloid production in tropical Dendrobium species. To a layman, the entries would appear unremarkable. To a botanist, they are a confession. And the empty planting bed? Specimen 47's final resting place. She destroyed it after the murder, pulled the plant, cleared the bed, raked the soil. But she could not destroy the logbook without arousing suspicion, and she could not alter it without the alterations being detectable. So she left it, trusting that no one who examined it would possess the knowledge to read what was written there." He turned from the fire and regarded me with an expression I found difficult to interpret. "The most dangerous killers, Watson, are precisely those whom decent men cannot believe capable of murder." I thought of Lady Constance in her greenhouse, speaking of her orchids with such evident love. I thought of her question to me in the garden, and the tired resignation in her voice, and I found to my discomfort that Holmes was right. I did not want to believe it, which was precisely, I understood, why the belief was likely true. Chapter 6. The Doctor's Confession. Of the many varieties of cowardice I have encountered in my years of medical practice and criminal investigation, none is so contemptible nor, I confess, so pitiable as the cowardice of a professional man who has betrayed the oath upon which his livelihood and his self-regard are jointly founded. I have seen soldiers break under fire and recover their honour. I have seen criminals confess with something approaching dignity. But the physician who has knowingly harmed a patient occupies a special category of wretchedness. For he has violated not merely a law or a social contract, but the fundamental compact between healer and sufferer that stands at the very root of civilized life. Dr. Horace Pelham, when at last he sat before us in the sitting room at Baker Street, was a man in the grip of precisely this species of wretchedness, and the spectacle of his unravelling remains one of the most uncomfortable memories of the entire Ashworth affair. Holmes had arranged the interview with characteristic cunning. He sent a note to Pelham's Harley Street practice requesting a medical consultation regarding the cardiac implications of certain alkaloid compounds, a phrasing designed to appeal to Pelham's professional vanity while concealing the true purpose of the meeting. Pelham arrived at 3 o'clock on a wet Thursday afternoon, impeccably dressed, his manner projecting the sober confidence of a man accustomed to being deferred to in matters of health and mortality. He shook our hands, accepted a chair by the fire, and settled himself with the air of a consultant granting an audience. "I understand you have questions about alkaloid cardiotoxicity, Mr. Holmes," he began, crossing one leg over the other with practised ease. "A fascinating area. I've had some experience with digitalis preparations, as you may know, and their effects on the cardiac." "I have no doubt of your experience with digitalis, Doctor," Holmes interrupted, his voice carrying that particular quality of restrained precision that I had learned to recognize as the prelude to an assault. "In fact, it is your experience with digitalis, specifically your administration of it to the late Sir Edmund Ashworth, that I wish to discuss." Something shifted behind Pelham's eyes. The professional ease remained in place, but it had become a performance rather than a state, a mask held up by effort rather than habit. "Sir Edmund was my patient for nearly 15 years, Pelham said carefully. "I treated his cardiac condition with standard preparations. His death, though unfortunate, was not unexpected, given the severity of his—" "Doctor." Holmes leaned forward, and the single word fell into the room like a stone into still water. "I have obtained Sir Edmund's complete medical records, the official records filed with your practice, and the private notes you kept in a separate ledger, which your nurse was good enough to produce when presented with a warrant this morning. I have also consulted with Dr. Reginald Mortimer of the London Hospital, who has reviewed your prescription history and has provided me with a written opinion. You were not treating Sir Edmund's cardiac condition, Dr. Pelham. You were creating it." The silence that followed was absolute. Pelham sat motionless in his chair, his face draining of colour with a completeness that a painter would have found instructive. I watched him from my position by the desk and saw the precise moment when the architecture of his composure gave way. Not a dramatic collapse, but a slow, structural failure, like a building settling into its own foundations. "I don't know what he began. "You prescribed digitalis at therapeutic levels for the first 10 days of treatment," Holmes continued, his voice neither raised nor cruel, but relentless in its clarity. "Thereafter, you increased the dosage at intervals that correspond not to any worsening of symptoms, but to your own billing records. Each increase justified an additional consultation. Each consultation generated a fee. Over the course of 5 weeks, you brought Sir Edmund's digitalis intake to a level that Dr. Mortimer describes as, I quote, reckless in the extreme and inconsistent with competent medical practice. You were not curing your patient, Doctor. You were cultivating his dependency to sustain your income." Pelham's hands had begun to tremble. He pressed them flat against his knees, a gesture I recognized from my own clinical experience as the involuntary attempt of a man to anchor himself against a rising tide of panic. When he spoke, His voice had lost all pretense of authority. "You don't understand," he said. "You cannot understand what it is to build a practice over 30 years and watch it crumble. My investments, I was advised, I was assured, they failed. Everyone. I'm 52 years old, Mr. Holmes, and I have nothing. My house is mortgaged. My consulting rooms are rented on terms I can no longer meet. Edmund Ashworth was my wealthiest patient. If I cured him, he would have no reason to continue seeing me. If I kept him dependent, just slightly, just enough to require ongoing management, I could bill the Ashworth accounts for years. I never intended to harm him. You increased his digitalis to dangerous levels to maintain a revenue stream," Holmes said. "Whether you intended harm is a question for your conscience and, eventually, for the General Medical Council. But it is not the question that concerns me this afternoon." He rose and moved to the mantelpiece, where his notes and chemical analyses were arranged in careful order. When he turned back to Pelham, his expression had changed, the prosecutorial sharpness replaced by something more searching, almost clinical in its attention. "Doctor, I want you to consider Sir Edmund's symptom progression very carefully. You began treating him approximately 6 weeks before his death, when he first presented with fatigue and cardiac irregularity. You prescribed digitalis at standard therapeutic levels. The symptoms continued. Yet you increased the dose. The symptoms worsened. You increased again. At each stage, you attributed the deterioration to the underlying condition and adjusted your treatment accordingly. That is correct. Now consider this." Holmes laid a chart upon the table between them, a timeline he had constructed, cross-referencing Pelham's medical notes with the symptom descriptions recorded in those notes. The initial symptoms, fatigue, dizziness, irregular heartbeat, appeared before your first prescription. You did not cause them. They were already present when Sir Edmund walked into your consulting room. Pelham stared at the chart. Yes, naturally. That is why he sought treatment. But certain symptoms in your later notes do not correspond to digitalis toxicity at all. This pattern of pupil dilation you recorded on the 14th day, bilateral, fixed, unresponsive to light changes. Digitalis does not produce this effect, and here, this discoloration of the fingertips you noted on the 23rd day, a faint yellowish staining beneath the nails. You attributed it to poor circulation. It is not poor circulation, doctor. It is a marker of chronic exposure to certain plant-derived alkaloids. Alkaloids that affect the heart through mechanisms similar to, but distinct from, digitalis. The colour that had drained from Pelham's face did not return. Instead, a new expression emerged, one I had seen before in hospital wards, on the faces of men receiving a diagnosis they had not anticipated and could not refuse. "A second poison," he whispered, "administered over the same period as your treatment, through a separate delivery mechanism. The symptoms you observed were never solely the product of your digitalis, doctor. They were the combined effect of your medication and another cardiotoxic agent, one that was already at work before you wrote your first prescription. Your overdosing did not kill Sir Edmund Ashworth, but it masked the true cause of his decline so thoroughly that no one, not you, not the household, not the coroner, thought to look for another explanation." I watched Pelham absorb this. The horror that crossed his features was not, I think, feigned. It was the particular horror of a man who has been living with one species of guilt, manageable, rationalizable, the guilt of greed and weakness, and who suddenly discovers that he has been an unwitting participant in something far darker. "My God," he said. "My God. I helped to hide it. The digitalis, the symptoms I was treating, they concealed. They concealed a murder, doctor. You did not plan it. You did not know. But your malpractice provided the perfect camouflage for a poisoner who needed Sir Edmund's decline to appear medically explicable. Every increase in your dosage obscured the evidence of another hand at work. Pelham sat for a long time without speaking. The fire crackled. Rain streaked the windows. At last he raised his head and looked at Holmes with the expression of a man who has passed through the worst of a storm and emerged into a landscape he no longer recognizes. "What do you need from me?" "Your complete records. Every note, every observation, every measurement you took during those 6 weeks. I need a precise medical calendar of Sir Edmund's decline. Dates, symptoms, or dosage changes, so that I may separate your contribution from the poisoners. You have been a poor physician, Dr. Pelham. You may yet be a useful witness." Pelham nodded slowly. He reached for the leather case he had brought with him, intended, I suspect, for the professional consultation he had been expecting, and produced a sheaf of papers that he laid upon the table with the care of a man surrendering arms. "Everything is there," he said. "Every record I kept. I will cooperate fully, Mr. Holmes. I owe the dead man that much, at least." Holmes took the papers without ceremony and began to examine them. After a moment he spoke without looking up. "You may go, Doctor. You will hear from Inspector Lestrade in due course regarding the matter of your prescription practices. I would advise you to engage a solicitor." Pelham rose, Moore collected his hat, and moved toward the door with the diminished gait of a man who has left something essential behind him in the room. At the threshold he paused and turned back. "Mr. Holmes, the person who did this, the poisoner, will you find them?" "I will." "And when you do, will you understand why they did it?" Holmes looked up from the papers. His grey eyes held the doctor's gaze for a moment, and whatever Pelham saw there caused him to incline his head, as though he had received an answer to a question he had not quite managed to articulate. Then he turned and left. The door closed. I listened to Pelham's footsteps descending the stair, each one heavier than the last, and then the distant sound of the street door opening and shutting. Holmes continued to examine the medical records in silence. "We can now strike the good doctor from our list of murderers, though not from the rolls of professional shame," he said at last, without raising his eyes. "But his confession has given us something invaluable. A precise calendar of the victim's decline, one that corresponds exactly with the pattern of botanical poisoning Professor Ainsworth described." He set down his pencil and reached for his pipe. "The circle narrows, Watson. 2 suspects remain, and only one of them has a greenhouse." Chapter 7. Threads Unravelled. There is a phase in every complex investigation, I have observed it often enough in Holmes's cases to recognise it as a reliable pattern, when the work ceases to be one of discovery and becomes instead one of elimination. The field of suspects, which at the outset appeared so crowded with possibility, must be systematically reduced until only the truth remains, however unwelcome that truth may be. The 7th day of the Ashworth investigation was given over entirely to this process of elimination, and by its end the tangled web of lies, debts, and grievances that had surrounded Sir Edmund's death had been stripped down to its essential thread. The unravelling began not at Baker Street but in Whitechapel, where Holmes had dispatched Wiggins and a select detachment of the Baker Street irregulars 2 days prior. Their quarry was a moneylender operating near the docks, the man to whom, Holmes suspected, young Victor had fled on the night of his father's death. Wiggins returned that morning with his report, delivered with the relish of a boy who knows the value of the intelligence he carries. The moneylender, a Mr. Solomon Katz, had refused to speak, but his bodyguard, a former prizefighter of enormous dimensions named Crabbe, who had been persuaded by a combination of Wiggins's charm and the promise of a sovereign, confirmed that a young gentleman matching Victor's description had arrived at approximately 10 o'clock on the night of the death, and had remained until 11:30, engaged in what Crabbe described with the brevity of a man unaccustomed to delicacy as a great deal of begging and not much in the way of paying. The alibi was solid. Victor had been in Whitechapel negotiating for his financial survival while his father died in Hampstead. When Holmes summoned the young man to Baker Street that afternoon and presented him with this evidence, the defiance that had characterized our earlier encounters collapsed entirely, replaced not by relief at his exoneration, but by a shame so acute that it seemed to cause him physical pain. He sat in the basket chair with his head in his hands. £40, he said, his voice muffled. I borrowed £40 from a Whitechapel moneylender to cover gambling debts. My father gambled away a fortune, and I who despised him for it, who screamed at him across the dinner table that he was destroying us, I have inherited his weakness along with his debts. He raised his head and looked at Holmes with reddened eyes. I am exactly like him, aren't I? You are 26 years old, Holmes replied. Your father was 58. The difference is measured in the choices one makes over the intervening decades. You have time. I suggest you use it. Victor departed in a state of chastened reflection. Holmes watched him go, then turned to me with a brief gesture that closed one avenue of inquiry and opened the next. James Farrow proved a simpler matter, though the unravelling of his deceptions contributed, in ways he had never intended, to the larger tragedy. Holmes had spent the previous evening analysing the Ashworth household accounts with his customary intensity, and the embezzlement was not difficult to trace. Small amounts diverted through fictitious vendor payments that Farrow had constructed with modest ingenuity but insufficient caution. Over 2 years the total exceeded £300. But the embezzlement was not the whole of it. Holmes had also traced a series of payments from a gossip journal called the London Whisper to an account held under a false name that proved to belong to Farrow. The secretary had been selling Sir Edmund's private correspondence, fragments of letters, details of business dealings, and, most significantly, hints of the relationship with Helena Graves, to a journalist who published them as thinly veiled blind items that anyone in Sir Edmund's social circle could have decoded. Confronted in the study where Sir Edmund had died, Farrow confessed to everything with the frantic volubility of a man who has been carrying a weight beyond his strength. His explanations were familiar in their architecture: the ailing mother, the inadequate salary, the small amounts that seemed so harmless at first. Holmes listened without visible sympathy, but when he spoke, it was to the consequence rather than the crime. The information you sold confirmed, for at least one person in this household, what had previously been only anonymous allegation. You were the unwitting conduit, Mr. Farrow, through which a suspicion became a certainty. Farrow stared at him in dawning comprehension, and the full weight of his small betrayals pressed down upon him visibly. Holmes dismissed him with the observation that he lacked the imagination and nerve for murder, and advised him not to travel. Reginald Thorne required less time still. A brief interview at the man's club, corroborated by testimony from the Ashworth butler, Thorne's own coachman, and a neighbour, established that Thorne had left the Ashworth house at precisely 10:15 on the night of the murder, and had been observed continuously until his arrival home 20 minutes later. He had no access to Sir Edmund's pipe after dinner, no botanical knowledge of any description, and his method of redress had been legal rather than lethal. A solicitor was already preparing proceedings at the time of the death. It was late in the afternoon when Holmes made the discovery that drew the remaining threads together. We had returned to the Ashworth house one final time, Holmes having obtained permission to re-examine Sir Edmund's personal effects. He moved through the items with his customary thoroughness until he reached the evening slippers, a pair of soft leather house shoes that Sir Edmund had worn on the night of his death. He turned them over in his hands, examined the soles with his lens, and looked up at me with the cold, precise satisfaction of a man who has found the final piece of a mechanism and watched it click into place. "Come here, Watson. Tell me what you see." I took the lens and examined the sole of the right slipper. Pressed into the soft felt was a quantity of fine soil. dark, rich, and embedded with small, pale fragments that caught the light. Greenhouse soil, I said. Not merely greenhouse soil. The pale inclusions are volcanic pumice. The fibrous material is sphagnum moss. This is a very specific growing medium, Watson. I've seen its precise composition only once before, in the raised beds of Lady Constance Ashworth's orchid house. It is the mixture she uses for her tropical dendrobium specimens. But Sir Edmund might have visited the greenhouse himself. In his evening slippers, these are indoor shoes, Watson, thin-soled, made for carpet and parquet. No man walks across a gravel garden path in shoes like these. The soil did not come from Sir Edmund visiting the greenhouse. It came from the slippers being handled by someone who had recently been in the greenhouse. Someone who picked them up, carried them, set them in the study in preparation for Sir Edmund's return from dinner. Someone whose own shoes or hands bore traces of the orchid beds. He set the slippers down and straightened. She prepared the study for him, Watson. While Sir Edmund sat at dinner with Thorne, Lady Constance moved between her greenhouse and this room. So she applied the final concentrated dose to his pipe. She laid out his slippers, arranged his reading, set the stage for the last evening of his life. And in her passage between the greenhouse and the study, she carried with her the soil of her own garden, a trace left not by a hand, but by a shoe. We stood in the dead man's study as the last grey light of November faded beyond the windows. Through the glass, the greenhouse was just visible, its long roof catching the final gleam of the sky like the surface of a dark river. Of our 6 suspects, I said slowly, 4 have now been accounted for. Victor, Pelham, Farrow and Thorne, their lies exposed, their secrets stripped bare, but their innocence of murder established. 2 remain, Holmes said. Lady Constance Ashworth and Helena Graves. One possesses botanical knowledge, opportunity, emotional motive, and a greenhouse whose soil now places her at the scene of the final poisoning. The other possesses a financial motive, a weak alibi, and a secret insurance policy. He paused. But you know which way the evidence tends, Watson. I did, and I found as we left the Ashworth house for what I believed would be the last time, that the certainty brought me no satisfaction whatsoever. Chapter 8. Specimen 47. Holmes did not speak on the journey to Hampstead. He sat beside me in the cab with his chin upon his breast and his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his overcoat, his eyes fixed upon some interior calculation that admitted no interruption. Lestrade sat opposite, returning his hat in his hands with the restless energy of a man who understood that something significant was about to occur, but was not entirely certain of its nature. The warrant, obtained that morning from a magistrate who had listened to Holmes's summary of the evidence with an expression of increasing gravity, rested in the inspector's breast pocket. None of us, I think, took any pleasure in its possession. Lady Constance received us in the morning room. She was dressed simply in dark blue, her hair drawn back from a face that appeared, if anything, more composed than at any of our previous meetings. If the arrival of a detective, a police inspector, and a warrant to search her private rooms produced any alarm, she concealed it with a completeness that I found almost more disturbing than open distress would have been. She read the warrant carefully, folded it, returned it to Lestrade, and inclined her head. "You will find my rooms at the top of the stairs, Inspector. The sitting room adjoins the bedroom. I keep nothing locked." This last statement proved, in the strictest sense, untrue. Holmes conducted the search with a methodical patience that I had witnessed many times but never ceased to admire. He moved through Lady Constance's sitting room with the unhurried deliberation of a man reading a book in a language he alone could understand, examining bookshelves, opening drawers, running his fingers along the joins of furniture with a sensitivity that seemed almost tactile rather than visual. The room was tastefully appointed and scrupulously tidy. A writing desk by the window, a chaise longue upholstered in faded green velvet, shelves lined with botanical texts and bound volumes of scientific journals. It was the room of an educated woman whose interior life was rich and whose exterior circumstances had taught her to keep that richness private. Holmes spent several minutes at the writing desk. It was a handsome piece, rosewood, Victorian, with brass fittings and a leather writing surface, and he examined it with particular attention, testing the depth of each drawer against the external dimensions of the frame. At the rear of the lower left compartment, his fingers found what they were seeking, a concealed panel, fitted with such precision that it was invisible to casual inspection, operated by a small brass catch, disguised as a decorative rivet. The panel opened to reveal a shallow space, perhaps 3 inches deep, and within it lay a small leather journal bound with a clasp. Holmes lifted it out and held it for a moment without opening it. I saw his jaw tighten, the only outward sign of whatever he was feeling, and then he carried it to the window, where the grey November light fell across its cover. The journal was locked, the clasp was simple, and Holmes opened it in moments with a thin instrument from his waistcoat pocket. The pages within were covered in Lady Constance's precise, slanting hand, but the text was not English, nor Latin, nor any language I could immediately identify. It appeared to be a cipher of some kind, composed of botanical nomenclature, arranged in patterns that suggested substitution rather than description. Holmes studied the first page in silence, his lips moving occasionally as he tested one interpretation and discarded it for another. Then he took a pencil from the desk and began to work, cross-referencing the botanical terms against what I assumed to be a key he was constructing in his head, drawing on his knowledge of plant taxonomy to decode the substitution pattern. It was painstaking work, and Lestrade and I stood by in silence, unwilling to interrupt a process whose importance we both sensed, even if only one of us could follow its mechanics. It took Holmes the better part of 40 minutes to decode sufficient entries to confirm what the journal contained. When he had finished, he set down his pencil and closed his eyes. He remained like that for several seconds, an uncharacteristic stillness that spoke more eloquently than any words of the weight of what he had found. "It is all here, Watson," he said at last. "Everything." The journal was not a diary in the conventional sense. It was a laboratory record, precise, clinical, and devastating in its implications. The early entries documented the development of Specimen 47, growth rates measured at weekly intervals, alkaloid concentration tests performed on leaf and nectar samples, crossbreeding notes recording each successive hybridization with the detached rigour of a professional scientist. There followed a series of entries recording the preparation of extracts, methods of grinding, dilution ratios, solvent tests, and then, more chillingly, a log of preliminary trials noting the effect of diluted extract on insects and small organisms kept in the greenhouse. But it was the later entries that arrested the breath. Beginning 6 weeks before Sir Edmund's death, the journal shifted from botanical record to something far more terrible, a systematic, dated chronicle of a man's decline, recorded with the same clinical precision that had characterized the orchid's cultivation. Day 4, increased fatigue, mild respiratory difficulty, appetite diminished. Day 12, cardiac irregularity more pronounced, pupils show characteristic dilation, pelham has increased digitalis, Maskin proceeds as anticipated. Day 23, significant decline in colour and energy, fingertip discoloration noted. He complains of the cold, though the house is well heated. Day 31, marked deterioration, shortness of breath at rest. He has cancelled his appointments for the week. Entry after entry, day after day, the meticulous documentation of a poisoning in progress, are written by the hand that administered it. There was no emotion in these pages, no hesitation, no remorse. They read like the field notes of a naturalist observing a process too interesting to interrupt. All but one. A single entry, dated 3 weeks before the death, the day I later calculated, on which Sir Edmund had informed his wife of his intention to divorce, broke the pattern entirely. The clinical detachment vanished, replaced by 5 words written in a hand that pressed so hard the nib had scored the paper beneath. He has left me no other door. Holmes laid the journal open to this page and held it for Lestrade and me to read. The inspector studied it, removed his hat, and rubbed the back of his neck with the slow, heavy gesture of a man confronting something he would rather not have found. "It's thorough, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said quietly. "I'll say that. Thorough and sad." Holmes closed the journal. He stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the garden below, where the greenhouse roof gleamed dully in the fading afternoon light. Then he turned and laid out the complete chain of evidence with the concise, dispassionate clarity that the law required and that the human heart resisted. The orchid alkaloid in the pipe residue, Specimen 47 in the greenhouse logbook, cultivated under conditions designed to maximize toxicity, the matching residue in the mortar and pestle, the greenhouse soil on the evening slippers, the destroyed planting bed, cleared of evidence after the final dose, the unaccounted orchid on the dead man's desk, placed there by a hand that could not resist a final gesture of authorship. And now the journal, the keystone that bound every other fragment into an unbreakable arch of proof. "Tomorrow," Holmes said, addressing himself as much as us. "We will confront Lady Constance tomorrow." He turned from the window and moved toward the door. At the threshold he paused, and I saw in his expression something I had rarely witnessed in all our years together. Not doubt, for the evidence permitted none, but a reluctance that went deeper than professional hesitation. "Tonight, Watson, I confess I have no appetite for justice." Chapter 9. No other door. The morning was cold and still, the sky a uniform grey that promised neither rain nor clearing, the kind of November day that seems to exist outside of time, suspended between seasons, between states. Holmes and I travelled to Hampstead in silence. I recall the details of that journey with an unusual clarity. The condensation on the cab windows, the sound of the horses' hooves on the wet road, the smell of damp wool from our overcoats, as though my mind, anticipating the gravity of what lay ahead, had resolved to preserve every peripheral detail in compensation for the central event it would rather have forgotten. Holmes had not slept. I knew this not from any visible sign of fatigue. He was, as always, immaculately dressed, his manner composed and precise. But from the position of his violin when I came down that morning, resting on the arm of his chair with the bow laid across it, and the cold ash in the fireplace that told of a fire left to die in the small hours, he had spent the night in thought, and whatever conclusions he had reached had not lightened his mood. I ventured, as we turned into the Ashworth Road, to ask whether he was certain. "I have never been more certain of the facts of a case, Watson," he replied, without turning from the window, "nor less certain of the justice of its conclusion." Lady Constance received us in the drawing-room. She was dressed in black, not the formal mourning of our first visit, but something simpler and more deliberate, as though she had chosen her clothing that morning with the understanding that it would be remembered. Her hair was drawn back plainly, her hands steady, her expression one of composed attention. Tea was brought, and she poured with the unhurried grace of a woman performing a ritual she had enacted 1,000 times before and might not enact again. Holmes accepted his cup and spoke for a few moments about orchids. It was not a stratagem, or not entirely. He asked about a cattleya she had mentioned during our greenhouse visit, inquiring whether it had survived the recent cold spell. She answered with genuine interest, and for a brief interval the drawing-room contained nothing more sinister than 2 intelligent people discussing a shared fascination. I sat with my own cup untouched, unable to participate in a conversation whose civility seemed to me almost unbearable given what was to follow. Then Holmes set down his tea. The quality of the air in the room changed. He did not accuse. He narrated. He told Lady Constance what he knew, not as an interrogation, not as a triumph, but as a story. Her story, told back to her with a care and a precision that I had never heard from him before, and which carried in its measured cadences something that I can only describe as respect. He spoke of the anonymous letter, Helena's act of wounded spite that had torn away the last veil of ignorance. He spoke of the months that followed, the quiet confirmation of the affair, the discovery of the child, the household funds diverted to sustain a second life that mocked the first. He spoke of the solicitors consulted and the avenues closed, the legal system that offered a wife of Sir Edmund's station no remedy and no escape. He spoke of Specimen 47, its conception, its cultivation, the patient genius of a woman who turned her deepest knowledge into an instrument of last resort. He spoke of the 6 weeks of gradual application, the pipe prepared with such care, on the clinical journal tracking what she had set in motion with a scientist's detachment and a wife's terrible intimacy. He spoke of the final evening, the concentrated dose applied while Sir Edmund sat at dinner, the study prepared for his return, the slippers carrying their trace of greenhouse soil, the weight in the darkened bedroom, the silent passage through the connecting corridor after the house had fallen quiet. And he spoke of the orchid, the single white bloom laid upon the blotter beside the dead man's hand, the one detail that was not necessity but something else entirely. Lady Constance listened without interruption. Her hands remained in her lap, her posture upright, her gaze fixed upon Holmes with an attention so absolute that it seemed to exclude not merely the room but the world beyond it. She did not weep, and she did not protest. She listened as one listens to a piece of music one has waited a long time to hear performed correctly. When Holmes finished, the silence that followed was of a quality I have never encountered before or since. Not empty, but full, charged with the weight of everything that had been said, and everything that remained unsaid. Then Lady Constance spoke. "You are wrong about one thing, Mr. Holmes." Holmes inclined his head, waiting. "The orchid was not a mistake born of emotion. It was deliberate. I wanted someone, someday, to understand that this was not done by a stranger. It was not done for money, or for spite, or for any of the sordid reasons that men kill one another in your experience. It was done by the woman who loved orchids more than anything in the world, and who was given no other door." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the measured steadiness of someone who has rehearsed not the words, but the composure required to deliver them. "I consulted 3 solicitors, Mr. Holmes. Each told me that in a divorce Edmund would retain the estate and I would receive nothing. My mother's care, she is 71 and requires constant medical attention, would cease. My greenhouse, my research, the papers I have published under my married name, all would become his property to dispose of as he wished. The woman who replaced me would inherit everything I had built, and I would be turned out without a shilling to sustain either my mother's life or my own. I was to be discarded like a spent bloom, and every legal authority I consulted confirmed that this was not merely possible, but inevitable." She looked at Holmes directly. "I exhausted every legitimate avenue, Mr. Holmes. I wrote to Edmund, I appealed to his family, I begged. I was met with indifference at every turn, and with cruelty when indifference no longer sufficed. The insurance policy was the only instrument that could preserve my mother's care and my own survival, and it contained a clause voiding payment in the event of divorce. When Edmund told me he intended to proceed with the divorce, he sealed his own fate, not because I wished him dead, but because he left me no other door." She fell silent. Holmes sat across from her, and I saw in his face a conflict I had seldom observed there before. He rose. He moved to the window and stood with his back to the room for a long moment. Then he turned, and his voice, when he spoke, was very quiet. "Lady Constance, Inspector Lestrade is waiting outside. I must ask you to accompany him." She rose, smoothed her dress with a gesture of unconscious elegance, and met his eyes. "Will you ensure that my greenhouse is properly maintained? The specimens require specific conditions. If they are neglected, years of work will die within a week." "I give you my word. Then I am ready." She walked to the door with the carriage of a woman proceeding to a formal engagement, rather than to the end of her liberty. At the threshold she paused and turned back. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes, for telling the story correctly." Lestrade entered. The formalities were brief. Lady Constance was led away through the morning room and out through the garden door, past the dormant rose beds, past the gravel path, past the greenhouse whose glass walls caught the grey morning light with a dull, aquatic gleam. She did not look back. Victor arrived as the police carriage was pulling away. He stood in the hall with his coat still on and his face white, understanding everything and nothing, and said to no one in particular, "She did it for us, didn't she?" Holmes did not answer. He stood at the window with his back to the room, watching the carriage disappear at the end of the road, and it seemed to me, standing beside him in that silent hall, that the question Victor had asked was not one that admitted of a simple answer. For the truth was that Lady Constance had done it for reasons so deeply intertwined that she herself might not have been able to separate the mercy from the malice, the love from the calculation, the desperation from the resolve. We rode back to London in silence. Chapter 10. The Empty Greenhouse. The trial of Lady Constance Ashworth occupied the attention of the London press for the better part of 3 weeks in the winter of 1895, and I do not propose to recount its proceedings in any detail here. The facts of the case, as Holmes presented them in his testimony, were not disputed by the defence. Lady Constance herself had instructed her counsel that she would not permit a denial of what she had done, and the evidence, in any case, admitted no plausible alternative. The prosecution argued premeditation of the most deliberate kind. 14 months of cultivation, 6 weeks of gradual poisoning, a final dose administered with full knowledge of its consequence. The defence, led by Sir Arthur Penrose, argued diminished responsibility born of systematic cruelty sustained over a decade, financial abuse, emotional abandonment, institutional indifference, and presented a succession of witnesses whose testimony painted a portrait of Sir Edmund Ashworth that bore little resemblance to the genial baronet his club acquaintances believed they had known. Holmes testified to the evidence. He did not editorialise. When asked by the prosecution whether the murder was premeditated, he answered simply that the facts indicated planning over a period exceeding 1 year. When asked by the defence whether he had formed any opinion as to the accused's state of mind, he replied that he was a consulting detective, not a physician of the mind, and that such determinations were beyond his professional competence. It was, I thought, after the most disciplined performance I had ever seen from him, every word precise, every inference grounded, every opportunity for commentary declined. He gave the jury the truth, and left them to make of it what they would. They made of it a verdict of guilty, accompanied by a strong recommendation for mercy that was read aloud in a courtroom so silent that the rustle of the foreman's paper was audible from the gallery. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances of the case and the evidence of prolonged suffering that had preceded the crime. He sentenced Lady Constance to life imprisonment rather than death. She received the verdict standing, her hands clasped before her, her expression unchanged. The aftermath of the Ashworth affair unfolded over the following months with the slow, but inevitable logic of consequences working themselves out upon the lives of those who had been drawn into its orbit. Victor Ashworth inherited the title, the estate, and its mountain of debt. He sold the Hampstead house at a loss, discharged what obligations he could, and relocated to a modest flat in Chelsea with 2 rooms and a north-facing window that he claimed was ideal for painting. I encountered him some months later at a small exhibition in a gallery off the King's Road, where his watercolours, spare, melancholy landscapes of the English coast, were displayed alongside the work of several other young artists. They were not masterpieces, but they were honest, and they bore no trace of the dilettante rebellion that had characterized his earlier artistic ambitions. He had become, it seemed, serious about the only thing his father had never valued. I purchased a small seascape and hung it in my consulting room, where it remains to this day. Helena Graves disappeared from London society shortly after the trial. Holmes, through channels he did not disclose to me, arranged for the child, Sir Edmund's daughter, a girl of 7 whose existence had been one of the case's more painful revelations, to be provided for through a charitable trust administered by a solicitor of Holmes's acquaintance. Helena's life insurance claim was denied on grounds of fraudulent origination, the policy having been taken out under false pretences by Sir Edmund himself. She was not prosecuted. I do not know what became of her, and Holmes, when I asked, said only that some threads are best left unfollowed. Doctor. Horace Pelham was struck from the medical register following a hearing before the General Medical Council, at which Holmes's evidence of overprescription was presented, alongside the written opinion of Dr. Mortimer. Pelham did not contest the findings. He left London quietly and established himself in a country practice in Dorset, where, by the accounts that reached me through professional channels, he became a more careful and more conscientious physician than he had ever been in Harley Street. I have sometimes reflected that disgrace, judiciously applied, can accomplish what years of professional comfort cannot. James Farrow was prosecuted for embezzlement and sentenced to 18 months' imprisonment. He served his term without incident, and upon release emigrated to Australia, from which distant shore no further word of him has reached me. Reginald Thorne recovered a portion of his losses through the partnership insurance clauses triggered by Sir Edmund's death, and continued in business, more circumspect in his choice of associates. Holmes kept his promise regarding the greenhouse. He wrote to Professor Ainsworth at Kew within days of Lady Constance's arrest, and the professor, who had followed the trial with a botanist's professional interest and a human being's dismay, arranged for the careful relocation of the entire orchid collection to the Royal Botanical Gardens. The specimens were transported in heated carriages under Ainsworth's personal supervision, and I am told that not a single plant was lost in the transfer. They were installed in a dedicated section of the tropical house, and where they thrived under conditions that Lady Constance herself could not have bettered. A small card affixed to the display case read simply, "From the collection of C. Ashworth." Of Specimen 47 there was no trace. Lady Constance had destroyed it before her arrest, uprooted, burned, its ashes scattered in the garden. The instrument of her crime, unlike its creator, left no evidence of its existence behind. Only the journal remained, locked away in a police evidence room, its botanical cipher a monument to the intersection of genius and despair. I visited Kew some weeks after the trial, and stood for a time before Lady Constance's orchids. They were beautiful, extravagantly, almost defiantly beautiful. Their strange faces turned toward the artificial light with an expression that seemed, to my perhaps too sympathetic imagination, one of patient endurance. A gardener passing by noticed my interest and remarked cheerfully that they were among the finest specimens in the collection. I thanked him and said nothing more. It was an evening in late January, the Ashworth case 2 months behind us. A new year arrived without ceremony, when Holmes and I sat by the fire at Baker Street, in one of those companionable silences that had become, over the years, as much a part of our friendship as conversation. Holmes was in a reflective mood. turning a small object between his fingers, something I could not immediately identify in the low firelight. "Does the case still trouble you?" I asked. He did not answer at once. The fire shifted, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, directed more at the flames than at me. She did not lack morality, Watson. She lacked options, and the distance between the two is not perhaps so great as the law supposes." I considered this. "And the orchid on the desk? Why did she leave it, if not from emotion?" Holmes was silent for a long moment. "Because even in the darkest act there is a human need to be known. She did not want the perfect crime. She wanted someone to understand what had been done and why. The orchid was not a clue left by accident. It was a confession left by design, waiting for someone who could read it." He opened his hand, and I saw what he had been holding. A single dried orchid petal, pale and translucent, pressed flat by long keeping. He regarded it for a moment, then slipped it between the pages of a book on the shelf beside him and reached for his pipe. He never spoke of it again, and I've set down this account with some reluctance, for of all Holmes's cases it is the one I find most difficult to regard with the professional detachment that a faithful chronicler ought to maintain. Justice was served in the matter of Sir Edmund Ashworth's death. The evidence was sound, the verdict lawful, the sentence measured. Yet I have never been less certain that justice and righteousness were the same thing, nor more aware that the distance between them is the space in which the whole of human tragedy resides.